Hey guys. So we're going to talk about some regulatory legislation today and conservation funding in general. I think your book is pretty slim on the legislation that it chose to cover. So I think we'll dive a little deeper into that with the application this week. So one of the earliest pieces of conservation legislation was the 1900 Lacey Act. So under the Lacey Act, it was unlawful to import, export, sell, acquire, or purchase fish and wildlife or plants. This act effectively prohibited the interstate transportation and commerce of fish and wildlife and plant species sold in violation of state or foreign law. The law covers all fish and wildlife and their parts and products. There were many plants covered under the Lacey Act, but in 2008, it was expanded to include a wider variety of prohibited plants and plant products. So it's been a pretty powerful piece of legislation and has stood the test of time. Another interesting piece of legislation is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and it warrants a little bit of a backstory. So in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, feathered hats, millinery trade was all the rage, and ornate and beautiful bird feathers were in high demand to make these hats. And there's a really great story about a young ornithologist, a guy named Frank Chapman, in 1866, who set out on a bird expedition. But instead of going into the forest or into the fields, he went into the streets of New York City and counted the number of birds that he saw on ladies' hats. He counted over 542 feathered hats with 174 either whole birds or bird parts associated with them. He saw 40 different species on these hats and really documented sort of what was the state of fashion at that time. Years later, there was really a grassroots uprising against the feather trade. And two Bostonites, two women, really were to think with their grassroots activism, which led to the Migratory Bird Treaty and effectively halted that massacre of birds that was underway at that time. And it was also at this time that the National Audubon Society was formed, really around the feather trade. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 provided regulation for the taking, selling, transportation, and importing of migratory birds for their feathers in an agreement between the US and Canada. It was updated in 1936 to include Mexico, and then amended again in 1972 to add 32 additional families that had previously been excluded. It's worth noting that in January of this year, the Trump administration proposed a final regulation that really limited the scope of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That went into review by the Biden administration in February of this year. And on May 6th, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced a proposed rule that effectively revoked the January 7th regulation proposed by Trump. So effectively keeping the teeth of what is take defined under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Another notable piece of conservation is the Migratory Bird Conservation Act. This provided for the acquisition and development of land to be acquired for migratory bird refuges. It also authorized investigation and publications on North American birds. The original act did not identify a funding source, but the funding source was provided through the Migratory Hunting and Conservation Stamp Act, also known as the Duck Stamp Act. The Duck Stamp Act provides a funding source through the sale of duck stamps, which are required for waterfowl hunters. Anyone over the age of 16 must purchase a duck stamp, and proceeds from that are set aside for conservation of the wetland habitats required for waterfowl protection. So over the many decades since, over 4.5 million acres of waterfowl habitat have been acquired and protected. Quite a few of these have gone into national wildlife refuges for their long-term stewardship as well. A few other pieces of early legislation that are notable include the Pittman-Roberts Act of 1937. This provided federal aid to states for wildlife restoration and acquisition work, with the funds being raised through an excise tax on firearms. It was matched by the states at 25%. And it was amended in 1970 just to include a few additional firearms that hadn't previously been included. The Bald Eagle Act of 1940 provides specifically for the protection of bald eagles and golden eagles. So when bald eagles rolled off of the Endangered Species Act, we were able to fall back on the Bald Eagle Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, for that matter, for the protection of that species. The Dingell-Johnson Act is very similar to the Pittman-Roberts Act, but with a focus on fish habitat and fish restoration. Provides federal aid to states for fish restoration work, and with the funds for it being raised via excise taxes on fishing tackle and gear. The Wilderness Act of 1964 provides one of the highest levels of federal protection for wilderness designated areas. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act allows for the purchase of federal lands through a federal offshore oil and gas lease. And it's worth noting that just last year, through America's Great Outdoors Act, we had the full and permanent authorization of LWCF. That means for the first time, we have the full $9 million set aside, and we have permanently authorized this as a funding source for land conservation. Those funds flow directly to the federal agencies that acquire land, to national wildlife refuges, national forests, national parks, and then also it flows to the states through programs like the Forest Legacy Program administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That allows for the acquisition of land, primarily upland habitats. And there's also funding set aside for local communities, for parks and parks infrastructure. And so I actually have a link to a little sort of LWCF coalition plug video that I got to be a part of this year, that is something that would be shared with lawmakers to help encourage support for this particular piece of legislation. There are just a host of other pieces of legislation that have a nexus with vertebrate species. A lot of these were enacted in the 1960s and the 1970s, and this is by no means comprehensive. We don't even have the Clean Water Act listed here, which affords for the protection of wetland habitats, which are vital for so many vertebrate species. But I'm not going to go over these one at a time, but we are going to dive a little deeper into the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act prohibits the importing, exporting, taking, possessing, selling, transporting of endangered and threatened species, with certain exceptions. The ESA provides for the designation of critical habitat and prohibits the destruction of that habitat. ESA provisions are enforced through the use of citizen suits, imprisonment, fines, and forfeiture. It was enacted in 1973 and is a very strong piece of legislation, probably one of the strongest we have for the protection of vertebrate species. A species or a subspecies is considered endangered if it is in danger of extinction through all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species is one that is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future if action is not taken. And there are three different arms of the federal government that administer the ESA. The Department of Interior deals with endangered animals generally. The Department of Commerce is working in the realm of marine mammals, and the Department of Agriculture works with endangered plants and administers the program on behalf of plants. The Endangered Species Act facilitates for the species recovery in quite a few ways. It makes it illegal to import and export, to take, possess, sell, or transport any endangered or threatened species. It also provides that lands necessary for the survival of the species should be designated as critical habitat. And this includes land that's presently occupied by the listed species and that's important for its continued and future existence. So the prohibition against taking of a listed species includes the destruction of that critical habitat. The ESA contains a number of exceptions. For example, a species may be exempted by the Endangered Species Committee or not covered if it's considered an experimental population. Other exceptions include incidental take by federal actions, national security issues, hardship cases, possession of pre-existing historical items, or certain actions by Native Americans. Provisions of the Endangered Species Act are enforced through citizen suits and also through civil and criminal penalties. So a criminal violation could result in imprisonment or in a fine of up to $50,000. A civil violation could result in a $25,000 fine. That would be a knowing violation, or a $12,000 fine for one that was not a knowing violation. And a violation of a minor provision might result in a $500 fine. So it's a good piece of legislation to understand well if you are a wildlife researcher, ecologist, or manager, for sure. So as of 2019, there are about 414 native species and subspecies of vertebrates that are listed as endangered or threatened. And I've got a breakdown there of the various vertebrate groups. There are almost 4,000 other species of plants and invertebrates that are awaiting classification. There are 14 species that have been delisted over the years, including the American alligator and the bald eagle. Another noteworthy agreement is CITES, or the Convention on International Trade of Wild Species. This conversations for CITES and the concept were first formed in the 1960s when international discussions of the regulation of wildlife trade for conservation purposes were something relatively new. In hindsight, it makes a lot of sense that we needed something like CITES to help with the regulation of trade. So annually, international wildlife trade is estimated to be worth billions of dollars. It includes hundreds of millions of plants and animal specimens. The trade is very diverse, ranging from live animals to plants to wildlife products, including food products, leather goods, wood products, medicines for various cultures. So levels of exploitation of animals and plant species are high, and the trade in them is sometimes lucrative. And so it's been formative and important to have an authority sort of monitoring that trade. And because the trade of wild animals and plants is across borders and between countries, the effort to regulate it really requires a high level of international cooperation to safeguard certain species. So today there are about 37,000 different species of animals or plants that are monitored that through the trade and through CITES. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a case study of a project that I've been involved with. That's a snapshot of the way conservation policy and funding come together with protection of flagship species. And this is an effort based in Georgia called the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Initiative. So the gopher tortoise is considered an at-risk species, one that's being considered for listing as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so I just had to pause because of a 3-year-old invasion of my office. And I've lost my train of thought. But so the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Initiative in Georgia is a private-public partnership between federal entities, the state, and private foundations and other private partners to preclude the listing of the gopher tortoise by preserving enough critical habitat to ensure the future of the species. So Georgia wildlife biologists have mapped what they call tortoise sheds, the areas across Georgia. So those partners committed $150 million to be split roughly 3 ways to acquire land that's essential for the conservation of gopher tortoise. And there are many secondary species that benefit listed here: the gopher frog, indigo snakes, flatwood salamander, striped newt, Blackman sparrow, manatee, and wood storks. So there's just been tremendous success in the conservation of land in Georgia, and that Georgia Department of Natural Resources is really a leader in the direct acquisition and conservation of land. Over a relatively short time frame between 2005 and 2014, there was a 28% increase in DNR owned lands in Georgia. We've seen since 2017 over $260 million invested in land conservation just through the Department of Defense's Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration program. So the REPI program allows for conservation around military base installations that benefits the base by reducing human populations right around a military base, but also increasing wildlife habitat protection in those same areas. So for that dual purpose. Georgia enacted the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Program Fund, which is going to allow for up to $20 million annually for land conservation as well. And various private foundations have made tremendous investments in the state. And so I had the opportunity to work on a 16,000 acre project along Georgia's coast, which was part of the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Initiative. It was considered one of the most important acquisitions to benefit gopher tortoise in the state. And this Ceylon tract was held by a development company that at one point had it permitted for over 20,000 homes, 3 million square feet of commercial space, but Open Space Institute So the Conservation Fund and the Open Space Institute secured the property, and over a 2-year period, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources is using various federal and state acquisition programs, including REPI and the Land and Water Conservation Fund through Forest Legacy, the North American Wetland Conservation Act funding, which is another federal funding source for protection of wetlands, the state, the new state, Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Fund. All of those funding sources together will help with the acquisition of this 16,000 acre tract to benefit gopher tortoise. And at the end of the day, what we'll see is now we know 4 viable populations of gopher tortoise protected. Over 4,000 burrows have been identified on that site. Rare maritime forest habitat, 4,000 acres of longleaf pine forest habitat and flatwoods, and over 6,000 acres of salt marsh habitat protected. That's it for this one. And we found one of the review questions to be worthwhile that were in the back of your book. So you guys can take a look at that.